Hello, this is Pastor Matthew Woods from Grace Lutheran Church in New Albany, Indiana, and this is the weekly devotion for August 2nd, 2021. Today's title, Handling the Unexpected. Years ago, on my vicarage year, long before cell phones, by the way, I was driving through the countryside on a highway from St. Louis to Salem, Illinois, back home to my vicarage house. My vicarage congregation, Salem, Illinois, was only a couple hours away from St. Louis, so occasionally I would end up going back to the city for just a little time out, for a night out with the friends and so on. South Central Illinois is mostly farm country and is mostly flat. While driving at about 1 a.m. in the morning, I encountered something unexpected. My headlights barely picked it up at first, and there it was standing there staring back at me and my headlights. My headlights barely picked it up, but it became clear. A year-old calf was wandering about in the middle of the highway of road, and I couldn't believe it. I was just dumbfounded. It was just standing there looking in my headlights. And I'm glad I saw it. Otherwise, my car would have been remodeled for sure. So I pulled off and tried to keep my headlights pointed at the calf in case another car would come. So at least if they saw headlights, they would know something's up, on the side of the road. So I got out thinking I could just shoo this dumb animal off the road. No, this is not a good idea. It didn't work. Just maneuvered enough to stay away from me and did not leave the road. Believe it or not, that night, others were also driving out on the road, and it seemed like somebody was going to come and clobber that poor thing. When I saw their headlights, I'd try to wave them down, and then I'd get out of the way, praying the whole time that they wouldn't turn that poor cow into some kind of hamburger. Realizing I wasn't getting anywhere with Mr. Hamburger, I ran over to the nearest home, a farmhouse, which happened to be right nearby. I figured it had to be there since they're the closest farm anyway. So I went and woke them up before someone got hurt. I got to the door and I knocked pretty hard a few times, and I was greeted by a very sleepy-eyed fella in shorts and a pair of boots, his wife behind him asking who it was. I apologized for waking them up at such a late hour. I think your calf has gotten loose, I said. It's out in the middle of the road. To which he responded, must be that same calf again. So we had a good old-fashioned roundup in the middle of the night, the middle of the highway, dodging the occasional oncoming vehicle. Well, it all worked out, thankfully. The farmer knew what to do, and in a short while we had that calf off the road and actually in a pen. After we got it rounded up, we had a quick, rather terse goodbye, and down the road again I was going. But I can honestly say that something that was a totally unexpected thing, and as it turned out, it became a fond memory for me from that time in my life. In fact, it's funny because it fit right into the context of the way that year went. That year was a total blessing in so many different ways, and it had so many surprises. Not the least of which, by the way, was my wife, who I'd meet later on that year. For Jesus' ministry, Jesus' ministry was a series of unexpected things, a lot of interruptions. Consider Mark chapter 6, 45 through 56 for today. It says, immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out, because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. As soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. They ran throughout the whole region and carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went in, went into the towns, villages, and countryside. They placed the sick in the marketplaces. They begged him to let them touch even the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. Now, all that night, until an hour before the sunrise, the disciples were rowing hard against the winds and struggling to make progress. Only got to the middle of the lake after all that time. They were worn out and perhaps a little bitter at Jesus. Remember, they wanted to send the people away, but Jesus said, no, you feed them. Jesus instead has them feeding 5,000 well into the evening of already a very long day, actually a few days. Originally, they were going into the boat on the last boat trip, to a solitary place to get some rest with Jesus by themselves. Well, that didn't happen. Instead, they were interrupted by the people who ran ahead of them. And so Jesus saw them, and he felt compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. The feeding of the 5,000 was a series of unexpected things and interruptions. So verse 52 tells us, for they had not understood about the loaves, that the disciples did not understand. Their hearts were hardened. The verse gives me the impression that they were a little fed up with the craziness. In chapter 4 and 5 of Mark's account, the gospel paints a picture of interruptions and unexpected things. And so why not one more? Jesus doesn't have a boat, so he just takes a stroll walking on the water. Like the calf in the middle of the road, seeing a person walking on the water would be a little bit out of place, don't you think? And that would probably grab my attention right away. Mark tells us that Jesus was about to pass them by, I guess to get on ahead of them and meet them on the other side. But see, their tired minds and their tired eyes and their tired bodies made them vulnerable to seeing Jesus, but then thinking he was a ghost. Jesus calls out to them, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. And then he climbs into the boat and the winds die down. By the way, just as they did in chapter 4, verses 35 through 39. Now we learn a few things about the unexpected things. First, expect your plans to be interrupted. Disciples planned to be in a solitary place. No, Jesus switched the gears and changed it into an opportunity for ministry. Now it may be brief, like herding a calf off the road in the middle of the night, or your plans may be completely changed, like not rowing to a quiet place for rest. One thing is for sure, the Lord will gladly throw in the unexpected things. In the case of the disciples, it was to shake up the hardness of their hearts for feeding of the 5,000 and get their attention on something bigger than this little bit of rest they were looking for. For the calf experience, I would like to think that it was a night that was good for me, as well as for the farmer. And for the disciples, the whole feeding of the 5,000, ultimately all of this was to teach them who Jesus was. Secondly, expect Jesus to get in the way of a dull heart or a sinful attitude. The disciples were grumpy, and they were tired, and they were fearful, and they were worn. They had seen a lot of action and hadn't even had the chance to catch up to all that Jesus was trying to teach them. When it says that the disciples' hearts were hardened, Jesus walking on water definitely would get them to rethink the loaves and what that meant and who Jesus was, which was the plan. The fact that they were amazed seems to indicate that they had missed something with all the miracles they had been witnessing, if you can imagine. And Jesus walking on the water would definitely steer their minds away from their own discomforts and fears. Jesus was waking them up to something greater than themselves, namely who Jesus is and what he was here to do. Finally, the unexpected gets our attention better than our best laid plans. Finding a calf in the middle of the road definitely sticks in my memory. Obviously, Mark's account also means that it stuck in the memory of the disciples. I think this is where God's grace does its best work in the unexpected things. The disciples never expected Jesus to catch up to them walking on the water. And even though the disciples were told several times, they didn't expect the resurrection of Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, to show up behind locked doors with them on that first Easter Sunday. In the same way, unexpected things have a way of grabbing our attention and leaving a deeper impression upon us, and much more efficiently than the things we plan in our head. And if the Lord can accomplish a greater faith in us that surprises, that leaves a deeper impression, especially about Him, then He will certainly endorse them. So maybe in those unexpected things, God's grace is leaving a deeper impression upon us. Maybe there's something there that God wants us to pay attention to, or that someone else benefits from by our interacting with that unexpected moment. In either case, God is active in that unexpected thing, and that's a good thing. So the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord look upon you with His favor and forever and always give you His peace in Jesus. I'm Pastor Woods. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.